Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Machuda.
And welcome, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and it's great to be with you today to, learn how to share, defend the faith with clarity, charity, and confidence. Got a great show in store for us today. Why? Well, because we're going to get into some shameless popery on this program, and to help us do that, we're going to have Joe Heschmeyer come on, he is the purveyor of Shameless Popery blog. He's also the author of a new book put out by Catholic Answers Press called Pope Peter, Defending the Church's Most Distinctive Doctrine in a Time of Crisis. And he was on once before. We're going to bring him on again, and we're going to talk about a really important subject, one of those things that seriously divides Protestantism and Catholicism, and that is, what is the church? Is the church a visible, organized structure that you could point to and identify in history? Or is the church just a invisible collection of like-minded believers? That's really the lay of the land, those two extremes. And, of course, the historic view is that, of course, Jesus established the church, and this church is like a city set on a hill that can be identified. And it had a very definite episcopal structure. And so these points are contested by many of our separated brethren. So Joe is going to be coming on the show. We're going to talk about the visible church, the structure of the visible church, really some very important fundamental key aspects of the church. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Also, as always, we have our critical thinking exercises, such as defining the fallacy segment. Today's Finding the Fallacy segment is, informal fallacy, is survivor's bias. This is not your run-of-the-mill fallacy. It's a very interesting path to this fallacy. We'll get to that in a couple seconds. Also, as we do on every program, we meet an early church father, and today's early church father is St. Gregory of Tours. So it's going to be lots of cool stuff in front of us. And as always, let's start off on the right foot by giving our shout-outs, our hat tips, our yoo-hoos to all of you watching live stream. Facebook, social media, hello, everybody. Welcome aboard. It's great to see familiar names there in the chat room. And also, I want to welcome all of you around the country listening on radio and also via podcast. And by the way, you can get our podcast at either our handy-dandy phone app. Oh, thank you, Beth. That's a very colorful emoji explosion on YouTube. By the way, you could get our podcast via our handy-dandy phone app, or you can get it at our flagship website, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org. And just go up to our shows, scroll down, and, bang, you have all our shows, a whole library. And by the way, this is a great opportunity to share, explain the faith. Maybe somebody's struggling with what exactly is the church. Maybe they have this idea that the church is just an invisible collection of like-minded believers. This would be a great show to share with them. And also another way to do that is to subscribe and like and do all those stuff, like I say every program. But we always have new listeners, thanks to you guys. And so I want to thank you for subscribing. And also I want to thank all of you who are about to subscribe in advance, because we truly appreciate it. It helps the visibility, and visibility helps, get this truth out. So we truly appreciate all your efforts. By the way, if you have a question for Joe, you can give us a call at 888-526-2151. That is 888-526-2151. Or you can always email us at the Dojo mailbox, which is questions@handsonapologetics.com. Let me say that again, because I kind of went through that really quick. It's questions@handsonapologetics.com. That is my website, and I need to update my website. Actually, I did something foolish on my computer, and everything is in disarray. So I'm in the process of turning it back into normal mode. And as soon as I do, I will update the website. By the way, there is also a free book there. I don't mention this too much, but I was on Catholic Answers a little over a week ago, I think, and we were talking about behind the Bible, what the Bible assumes you already know. And so I actually have that in book form, and I'm actually giving it away free in ebook format on my website, handsonapologetics.com. So if you put your name on my mailing list, it will send you a link to download it and enjoy. It's just all some cool stuff about the Bible. All right, so without further ado, why don't we jump into our exercises? The finding the fallacy for today, like I mentioned, is survivor bias fallacy. And survivor bias is a logical error of concentrating on people or things that made it past some selection process, overlooking those that did not, typically because of their lack of visibility. So this is actually a good thing to keep in mind when you're fact-checking things. It actually developed during World War II when planes that would go on bombing runs, the few that would survive the bombing runs would come back, and they would take note of all the bullet holes in the planes. And then originally, what they were going to do is supplement the airplanes with extra armor in the places that had the most bullet holes. That is until somebody realized the survivor bias is going on. And actually, the thing that made the plane survive wasn't where the bullets went through, but where they didn't go through. So the whole strategy switched to fortifying with extra armor the places that didn't have bullet holes, namely in order to help planes survive. And so that's a great example of the survivor bias. So whenever you're looking at evidence, any kind of evidence, you need to keep that selection process in mind. So that also means, by the way, if you're looking at early church fathers, be careful not to cherry pick. Make sure you recognize also fathers that disagree, and also recognize that there could be many writings that didn't survive the ages. So you have to keep all that in mind as you're trying to sort through all the evidence from the early church. So that is our fallacy for today, survivor's bias. Why don't we jump to the Meet the Early Church Father for today, who is St. Gregory of Tours, who lived between AD 138 to AD 538 to AD 593 or 94. That's a big difference, 538, 593. St. Gregory, Bishop of Tours, was the son of a respected senatorial family in Gaul. He was born on November 30th, 538 in Arverna, in modern-day Clermont-Ferrand. His great-grandfather, grandfather of his mother Armentia, was Gregory, the Bishop of Lagrange. And Nistius, Bishop of Lyon, was his mother's great-uncle. Gallus, the Bishop of Clermont, was the uncle of Gregory's on Gregory's father's side. And Gregory's father, Florentinus, died young, and was, as it was Gallus, Florentinus's brother, who imparted to Gregory his earliest Christian training. So Gregory had a lot of bishops in his family tree. So after his ordination to the diaconate, Gregory was taken ill, and it was about the year 563 when he made a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Martin of Tours, where he hoped for a cure. 10 years later, in the middle of his 30s, he was elected Bishop of Tours to succeed another of his mother's relatives, Euphronius of Tours. And his election was so celebrated that Ventantius Fortunatus, boy, that's a great name, wrote a poem in honor of Gregory's accession to his episcopate. Gregory was a man of particular grace and honor, even among his peers and contemporaries. He enjoying enormous respect throughout Gaul, and serving often as an emissary for King Chilbert II. The only thing that prevents our styling Gregory as the greatest romantic of the Romantic age is the fact that such titles belong already to his perpetual friend, Ventinius Fortunatus. He died on November 17th, possibly I keep getting the wrong dates, possibly 593, but more likely 594, and he's the author of two works. One's on the history of the Franks in 10 books, and probably his much more famous work is his 8 books of miracles. The 8 books of miracles, by the way, consist of separate writings that were composed at various times, and they were finally combined into one work by Gregory himself. And I want to just read really quick a quote from it, because in his book of miracles he speaks about Mary's Assumption, which we just celebrated. Of course, the course of this life having been completed by Blessed Mary, when she would have been called from the world, all the apostles came together from their various regions to her house. And when they had heard that she was about to be taken from the world, they kept watch together with her. And behold, the Lord Jesus came with his angels, and taking her soul, he gave it over to the angel Michael, and withdrew. At daybreak, however, the apostles took up her body on a bier and placed it in a tomb, and they guarded it, expecting the Lord to come. And behold, again, the Lord stood by them, and the holy body, having been received, he commanded that it be taken to the cloud into paradise, where now rejoined to the soul, Mary rejoices with the Lord's chosen ones, and in the enjoyment of the good of the eternity, which will never end. And that is St. Gregory of Tours. Coming up next, we're going to be talking with Joe Heschmeyer about the visible church. Stay tuned, folks.
Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. Male and female he created them. According to Pope St. John the 23rd, it is not true that some human beings are by nature superior and others inferior. All human beings are equal in their natural dignity. May God help us to look upon everyone as a person created in his image and likeness, and treat everyone the same without favoritism or prejudice.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is?
Will it be a boy?
Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat, and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. And the topic today is the visible church. And to help us work through that, we're going to engage in some shameless popery with Joe Heschmeyer, previously a litigator in Washington, D.C., and then a seminarian at the Archdiocese of Kansas City. Joe now works as a Catholic apologist, blogging at Shameless Popery. He also has a new book out, by the way, by Catholic Answers Press, which is called Pope Peter, Defending the Church's Most Distinctive Doctrine in a Time of Crisis. And Joe, welcome back to Hands on Apologetics.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, let's since this is the second time you've been on, and we've had a lot of new listeners. Maybe if you could give us kind of a thumbnail sketch of your journey of faith and how you ended up here.
Well, the short version is I grew up Catholic, but without maybe the greatest catechesis. It wasn't exactly a golden age of apologetics in, the mid 80s and early 90s. And so I kind of made it to college without knowing a lot about my Catholic faith. My RA in college went on to become a very good priest, and he was a tremendous resource for me, really kind of introducing me to the intellectual depths of the faith. This led to an intellectual conversion, then a spiritual conversion. The latter happened when I was in law school, studying to be a litigator.
Wow.
So I was an attorney for about a year and a half, and then I really felt like God was calling me to discern the priesthood. So I spent 5 years doing that, discerned I wasn't called to the priesthood, and then started working for a group called School of Faith, or Holy Family School of Faith. And I get to use the theology, the philosophy, and the public speaking kind of all wrapped up in one.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Wow. Feeling a call to the spiritual life while in law school. That's quite a feat. I used to be a manager for a law school bookstore, so I know what the students go through. Boy, talk about an environment you would hear the Lord calling you. That's pretty intense. Wow.
It's a pretty different place. Yeah.
Did you finish your law degree?
I did. I practiced for about a year and a half.
Okay. Great.
So
wow.
I did litigation out in D.C.
Very good. Yeah, so how did Shameless Popery come about?
So it was during that time in law school. I was about halfway through, and I started, discovering one really amazing thing after another about the faith. Like for years, I'd kind of gotten the answer, like, this is just the rule because it's the rule. And that's so intellectually unsatisfying. But as a kid, it just seemed like that was every adult's kind of explanation for why things were this way in the faith. And so when I actually discovered, like, oh no, like there's actually a really good reason why we believe in the real presence. There's a really good reason for the papacy. There's a really good reason for all these things that seemed totally arbitrary before. I got so excited about it. I started telling all my friends about it. But unfortunately, a lot of my friends were not Catholic and were not asking these questions. And so I was just being so obnoxious. And I was like dimly aware I was being really obnoxious in the back of my head. And I thought, I need to start a blog so I have an outlet. I can talk about this with people who care. And I don't like alienate all of my real life friends. And in the meantime, like a lot of my friends have gotten more interested in it. And, I think it's been helpful. And it really, like, this was originally just a thing they could kind of read if they wanted to. And I never really expected it to take off. And that was 2009. So it's been 11 years now. So my position was always like, if I run out of things to talk about, I'll just close up shop and move on. And that hasn't really happened yet. The faith is really exciting. It's really worth exploring. And even now, even after all these years of really studying it, I feel like I'm always learning some new insight or discovering some new aspect that I really want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, boy, your experience parallels mine in lots of ways. I was familiar with the Shameless Popery blog for years, before you wrote the book, and we were able to meet up, and it's great stuff. So, thank you so much for doing your ministry. You've helped a lot of people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate you saying that.
So where did the book come from, the idea of Pope Peter?
Well, it really was in two parts. So I realized pretty early on that my own assumption when I started looking was that of like a normal American Christian, which is I need to find all the right answers on my own and then find a church that more or less agrees with those answers. And that's actually like a weirdly unbiblical way of approaching the church. It's a weirdly unbiblical way of approaching orthodoxy. Like, you won't find early Christians behaving in that way, but that's just like the starting assumption. I don't want to say all of us have, but a lot of us have. When we go, like, even people of good faith, even people who might be interested in the Catholic Church, they say, like, I've got this list of reasons I got to get straight. It seems to me like the church is wrong on these 22 areas. If I can get these straight, then I'll join. But in all of that, you're still in the driver's seat as the sheep instead of allowing the shepherd to actually guide you. So it's a weird inversion of the model of the church Jesus lays out, the model of the church we see in the New Testament, the model of the church we see in the Old Testament even, and certainly the model of the church in the early few centuries of the church. So I think when I realized that, I thought, okay, like, we need to talk about what we mean by church, because Catholics and Protestants have such a different kind of understanding. So for years, I've been wanting to write that book that was about the church with a little bit about the papacy. But after Pope Francis and after a lot of my Catholic friends started to kind of freak out about, like, what do we make of the Pope? Then I realized I had to write a book about the Pope with a little bit about the church. Like, the emphasis changed in that sense. And it really is one of these issues where, I think I said this last time I was here, like, if the church really has the papacy, like, if the Catholic Church is right about the papacy, then everyone should be Catholic. If the Catholic Church is wrong about the papacy, then no one should be Catholic. So we don't have to do the whole 22-point list. We can just say, let's look at this one issue. And if this is right, then we'll know the answers to everything else on the list.
Yeah, very good. So, who would have thought that the purveyor of Shameless Popery would write his book on the Pope? You know, is this your first book, by the way?
It's kind of tied. So in the same month, 2 books that I wrote came out through 2 different publishers. Oh. So I had another book through Our Sunday Visitor called Who Am I, Lord? Finding Your Identity in Christ. Or I should say, I do have another. I mean, it just came out a couple months ago. So these 2 books came out virtually simultaneously because of COVID and everything else. I was originally expecting Pope Peter to be my second book out, but they kind of came out about the same time.
Wow. Well, congratulations. That's quite a feat. 2 books simultaneously from 2 different publishers.
Thanks. A feat of not knowing how to schedule, I think.
Well, you know what? When it comes to bookmaking, it's like it's totally in the hands of the Lord, because it's just amazing all the different things that will pop up and, you know, sideline things, or will go through fine. You never know. That's a very important perspective, because you're right. Our separated brethren, not all of them. I mean, there's all sorts of different views, from High Church Anglicanism to, you know, fundamentalist Baptist view, that, you know, the church could be visible to some extent, but then on the other side of the spectrum, there's people who are, the church is just like-minded believers that it's a visible collection of these people. So where do you want to start?
Well, I was going to say, I really like that point, because I think as Catholics, one of the big mistakes we make is expecting Protestantism to be a lot more uniform or unified in its beliefs than it really is. So I think that maybe the first takeaway I want to make sure everyone gets is, if you want to talk to a Protestant about their view of the church compared to your own, you need to start by finding out what their particular view of the church is. Like, we can say Luther said this, Calvin said this, but that is no guarantee that your neighbor down the block thinks what either of those guys thought. And their view may not even be the view of, like, the church that they're technically a part of. It's a totally different way of understanding a relationship to authority from what we're used to. So with that said, why don't we start with Luther and Calvin, and then we can maybe get to the Baptists after that.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, I can give a little bit of an intro if you'd like.
Sure, yeah.
So, yeah, kind of the seeds of the Reformation are planted before Luther with Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, who were 2 of what are sometimes called the proto-reformers, or the morning stars of the Reformation. These were 2 guys who were Catholics who ended up being excommunicated and condemned for their views, and their views largely on the church. And so they were living at a time when there was quite a bit of corruption in the church. And one of their arguments was, well, corrupt bishops and corrupt priests aren't really a part of the church. And you can see why that would be an appealing kind of doctrine, but it led them to a really kind of bizarre view of the church, where one of the apostles wasn't even part of the church. So Judas, Wycliffe explicitly argued Judas was an apostle, but he wasn't a bishop, and he wasn't really a part of the church at all. But if you read 1 Corinthians 12, you'll see that, you know, St. Paul talks about apostles as first in the church. So a church that doesn't have enough room for all 12 apostles is too narrowly defined. So that's the first kind of idea. This becomes like one of the pivotal doctrines of the Reformation, which is the church is just a collection of the saved. And so as a result, the church isn't the visible church that we see, which has both saved and damned people. Rather, the church is something that is necessarily just invisible. This idea, Luther buys into this pretty well, and it really is his buying into this that solidifies the Reformation being a real break from the Catholic Church, because once he starts to buy into Wycliffe and Huss, he no longer has any way back to the church. In the early days, he actually submitted the whole debate about justification to the Pope, and he said, "You're the vicar of Christ, whatever you decide, I'll obey it." And the Pope doesn't agree with him. And so by that point, Luther's decided the Pope's actually the Antichrist, and the church isn't really the church, and that the real church is something invisible that nobody can see. So this becomes, like, in some ways, an even more pivotal doctrine for the Reformation than the whole debate on justification, because it means that you can't even solve the debate on justification because you don't know who you can trust.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, looking from Luther's perspective, I mean, he's surrounded by the visible church, and all his followers are, Catholics or Catholics on their way out, and he's not teaching something contrary to the church. The only way he could do it is to reimagine what the church truly is, which seems to be what he did.
Yeah, and once you do that, there really is no limit. So one of the examples I like to give, I don't give this in the book, but I think it's appropriate to kind of share, is William Lane Craig is, I think, a Protestant known to many Catholics as well. He's a great Christian apologist, but he's a Christological heretic. He believes in monothelitism. He denies that Christ has a human will. He studied under Norman Geisler, another one of these kind of leading lights of Protestantism, who just died last year. And Geisler condemned Craig's position as heresy, and Craig condemned Geisler's position as heresy. So within evangelical Protestantism, two of the best known figures, two of the most respected figures, are condemning one another as heretics. And the question for an ordinary person ought to be, to who do we go? Like, where do we go to find, like, if there's a Christological debate, who can resolve it between Craig and Geisler? What authority can we point to? They're both reading the same Bible. They're both brilliant men. They're both well-respected and well-revered. One of them isn't obviously, like, in it maliciously. So how do we know who's right and who's wrong? Are we just all expected to be better scholars than those two? Because I'll go ahead and say, overwhelmingly, we're not. Overwhelmingly, we're not as well-read. We're not as brilliant. We're not as insightful. And so here's this issue of tremendous importance. And without something like a church we can turn to settle, we're really left with no recourse to resolve even the most basic of doctrinal issues.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse.
Very good. Well, hey, I hear the music coming up. That's a great place to hit pause. We are chatting with Joe Heschmeyer of Shameless Popery about his new book, Pope Peter In. We're talking about the visible church. Stay tuned, folks.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse Show, also from Jesus 911. Let's face it, we all need to use the internet, but we need screen accountability. Why? Pornography is a huge problem, especially on the internet. And every time we tap into the internet, we get bombarded with images and temptations that degrade our humanity. So we need Covenant Eyes to block these pornographic sites and advertisements from infiltrating our lives. Covenant Eyes helps us take custody of our eyes and custody of our intellect. So I recommend you go to covenanteyes.com and type in the promo code, VMPR, to support the network. Protect yourself and your family from the imminent threats on the internet. www.covenanteyes.com, code VMPR, live porn free. Thank you for listening to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Thank you. God bless you. Keep the faith.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. And we're chatting with Shameless Popery author and also the author of Pope Peter, Defending the Church's Most Distinctive Doctrine in a Time of Crisis, put out by Catholic Answers Press. You can get it at shop.catholic.com. We're talking about the visible church. And Joe, yeah, that's a very interesting example where you have William Lane Craig, very prominent Protestant apologist, especially in theistic apologetics, and Norm Geisler, who are at odds on something as fundamental as whether Jesus had a true human will, and where else do you go to solve this problem?
Yeah, so I mean, you can't go to church history and church tradition. I mean, there's an ecumenical council that condemns Craig's position, and Craig acknowledges this in a book that he co-wrote with J.P. Moreland. And they basically just say, well, that ecumenical council was heretical. But as an evangelical, they can do that because they don't have any way of knowing that it's infallible or it's inspired because they've rejected all of the things you could put your hope in. You just have to hope that your interpretation of the Bible is personally infallible on all of the important doctrines. And that seems to me to be an impossible bar to reach. And anyone who's really given time to understanding Christology or Trinitarian theology will see that like their hope of doing that on their own is really it's to say an uphill battle is not nearly strong enough. It's a virtual impossibility.
That's a very good point. Not only that, but like you said, there's a whole host of Christological points, Trinitarian points that are just as subtle and just as important too. Yeah, I mean, because even though this issue of whether Christ had a human will or not it is, like you said, a subtle doctrine, it's really important for knowing what we mean when we say that Christ is fully God and fully man. If we just say it doesn't matter, we're ultimately saying the incarnation. It doesn't matter what we mean by that. And that's a dangerous road to go down. Like the reason we care about the particulars of what does it mean to say Christ is fully human, what does and doesn't he have in common with you and me, like those are just basics in terms of understanding who Jesus is and how we can relate to him. And so if we can't get those things right, it really makes anything like a personal faith kind of impossible in the sense that you can say the words, I believe in the incarnation, but you don't know what you mean by those words in any real sense. And so it becomes almost meaningless verbiage. That's the danger anyway. So all of that's to say, like having a visible church that can settle doctrines is so important. These questions are not smaller than the Judaizer controversy in Acts 15. In a way, like this is a bigger issue than what the early church was facing. Right. Yeah. So you're basically saying, I believe in the incarnation as I believe it. You can
exactly.
Your faith in your faith.
Exactly. And so it strips words of any kind of objective meaning. I mean, we see this in a lot of areas, right? Like a lot of Protestants will affirm the creed where it says, I believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church. But if you look at what those early Christians meant when they said those words, it's not what modern Protestants mean. They mean they believe in an actual visible structured church. And that church was at a council when it came up with those words, like two councils, Nicaea and then First Constantinople, that it is the church assembled at council. So if you reject the ability of the church to do that because you don't believe in that church, maybe you shouldn't use the creed that says that you do believe in that church. I mean, it's just taking words and stripping them of their meaning. And I think it's really dangerous to say, well, I believe those words as I mean them, because we no longer have anything like an objective language. There's no longer a way to communicate. You have some purely private language inside your head that none of the rest of us can access. It'd be more honest to just say, I think the early Christians didn't know as much about Christianity as I do. I think, they didn't understand the church, and I do understand the church. That position, as bombastic, as seemingly arrogant as it would appear, would at least be, I think, more candid. And at least it wouldn't be playing games with words. That if we redefine what we mean by church, then we can, affirm it, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's not an uncommon assertion either, that the church, the early church was wrong and we got it right, and so we can pick and choose, which fathers, which councils agree with us, essentially.
Yeah, it makes it a very difficult thing. And this is, again, why, the very first point was figure out what the particular person you're talking to believes, because it's very easy to respond to a different form or a different flavor of Protestantism. And in a real way, there's almost as many forms of Protestantism as there are human beings, because there's no need to agree with anyone. There's no need to agree with Luther, no need to agree with Calvin, no need to agree with your local church, no need to agree with the church fathers or the early ecumenical councils. You might prefer to do that. You might find that to be the safer course. But if someone else charts a different road, you've got really no basis upon which to tell them that they're wrong, if the whole Catholic understanding of the church is wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very important point, because I know from my own experience, I've talked to Lutheran ministers who don't hold on to certain teachings of Luther. I met with Baptists who don't believe certain things Baptists propound. It really does come down to the individual and finding out what they understand and working from there.
Yeah, exactly. So I know frequently, like especially in the early days of Shameless Popery, I would fall into this trap myself, where I'd respond to some Protestant theologian or scholar or one of the early reformers, and people say, oh, that's a straw man. And I realized after a little bit what they meant by straw man was usually like, that's not the particular form of Protestantism that I affirm. I've read a different set of authors, and they say a different thing, which that's not really what a straw man is. But neither here nor there. It was helpful in kind of starting with listening to say, okay, what is it you believe about the church? Now, having said that, maybe we could talk about just a few kind of general things listeners should know about the church for when they get into these kind of conversations.
Okay, yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so one of the places I already alluded to this is to look at the role of the apostle Judas. Now, the reason I mention this is because one of the big questions a lot of Protestants have is whether unsaved people are part of the church. Or in some of the, like Calvin and others will say that there's a visible church and there's an invisible church. And sometimes they'll view it as like two different churches. This is where you want to like clarify what the other person believes. Mm-hmm. But Judas is clearly a part of the church, and Jesus says as much at the end of John 6. He says, "Did I not choose you 12, and one of you is a devil?" So he's making it very clear that here's this guy who is a part of the visible church. He is an apostle. As I mentioned before in 1 Corinthians 12, apostles are the governing structure of the church. And yet, by all appearances from the Bible, he doesn't seem to be saved. So this poses a real problem for anyone who says only the saved are part of the church. That's one way to go with it.
Okay.
Another place to look is Matthew 13, when Jesus describes the kingdom as containing it as a net that contains both good fish and bad fish, which he clarifies are the saved and the damned. Now that's just explicit. That's just telling you outright the kingdom on earth is going to have both. He doesn't say, the true kingdom only has good fish. He says exactly the opposite of that. You also see this in the parable of the wheat and the weeds. And so in that parable, he actually prohibits you from trying to pull up all the weeds to create a wheat-only kingdom. And he says, wait till the end of time, and the angels will do that. Because if you try to pull up all the weeds, you might pull out some wheat as well. What that means is anyone who comes along promising you a wheat-only church, a net with only good fish, is promising you a different church than Christ's church. Because the one Jesus gives us isn't that one. And so we know they're offering a counterfeit. We know that that's just not, it would almost be like, Canadian dollar coins, like the loonie. It's actually like, I think 13-sided. It looks round at first, but it actually has these kind of rough edges. So if someone offered you a loonie with no rough edges, you would know it's a counterfeit. You would know it wasn't the real coin. And so the real church, it's got rough edges. It's got bad fish. It's got weeds in it. And it was promised from the beginning that it would. And anyone who reads the Gospels or reads Acts sees that it had bad fish from the beginning, and that even the good fish have some bad spots in them. And this is one of the reasons why Christ doesn't promise this perfectly pure church, because it wouldn't leave any room for even the sinfulness and error of the saints, right? Like, there are moments where even the apostles, even the good apostles, act really poorly. And so if they lost their status the minute they acted poorly, you would have a church with nobody left in it, because all of us are sinners, right? Like, there would be no space for us in Christ's church if you had to be totally immaculate, just be Jesus and his mom, and that's a pretty limited church, right?
Right. Yeah.
So those would be a couple places I would look to. Maybe the other place to look would be in Matthew's gospel as well, when Jesus gives the example of the city on a hill and the light that you can't hide under a bushel basket. Those are ways he's describing our role as his followers, and very clearly what he's talking about there is visibility, that the followers of Christ are in a structured society like a city, and moreover, like a city on a hill that's visible to the whole world, so the whole world can be converted by the example and witness of Christians. So any kind of invisible church totally contradicts that idea, because that's putting the light under a bushel basket. An invisible light or an invisible city on a hill, it just makes a total mockery of the actual like parables Jesus is putting forward. And then the final thing I'd say is, like, put it on the other person and say, where do we see anywhere in Scripture where Jesus either A, says that the church is invisible, B, says that there are two churches, one visible and one invisible, or C, says that there are no unsaved people who are ever a part of the body or ever a part of the church. And you'll find that there's just nothing. Like, this is a doctrine built basically out of whole cloth, basically out of our discomfort with the idea of there being other sinners and worse sinners than us in the church. But that's not coming from anything in the Bible. That's coming from our own desires, not from anything Jesus is teaching.
Yeah, and throughout history, over and over again, a lot of the heresies were trying to make the perfect pure church, weren't they? Like the Gnostics and the Docetists and all sorts of groups that that the church is only for the enlightened or the purified, and then there might be kind of a rank and file type Christian, but they're not really truly part of the church.
Yeah, it is. There's a certain kind of spiritual elitism that it's easy to fall into. This idea that, well, I know the real truth, the hidden secret knowledge, or just I'm holier than my neighbor, so I can be a part of the church and my neighbor can't. But yeah, I think the Donatist example is a great one. We've been through all of this before.
Yeah, very good. I hear the music coming up, Joe. We are chatting with Joe Heschmeyer about the visible church. Great discussion. More to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics. Stay tuned.
Help the Helpless, a Minnesota St. Paul nonprofit organization chaired by Father of Tyr and volunteers, is humbly asking you for your kind support to help the poor and the handicapped children in India and Ecuador. Through financial support from the Help of the Helpless benefactors, the children are provided with clothing, food, education, shelter, and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The mission is to help children thrive and become self-sufficient young adults leading productive lives. We also provide aid to poor families in Ecuador with food baskets, medicines, medical assistance, and help with funeral needs for the deceased. The work in India is done by Father Antonio's organization, St. Mary's. In Ecuador, the work is being done by the Servant Sisters of the Home of Mother. You can call us at 877-762-8857. To learn more, please visit our website, www.helpthehelpless.org. God bless you.
Jesus said to the apostles in Luke chapter 10, "Whoever listens to you listens to me, and whoever rejects you rejects me." According to St. Boniface, in her voyage across the ocean of this world, the Church is like a great ship being pounded by the waves of life's different stresses. Our duty is not to abandon ship, but to keep her on course. May our Lord help us remain ever faithful to His Church, to aid and defend her.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. We're talking about the visible church that Jesus left, and we're chatting with Joe Heschmeyer, who's a blogger of Shameless Popery, also the author of Pope Peter, Defending the Church's Most Distinctive Doctrine in a Time of Crisis, put out by Catholic Answers Press, and also the author of Who Am I, Lord? Finding Your Identity in Christ, and that's from our Sunday Visitor. Is that correct, Joe?
It is.
Okay, and yeah, boy, great points. Because if someone says that only the purified, only true Christians are part of the church, they really do go against Jesus's parables and try to it's just what I want to say, a car wreck through church history of people who attempted to do that.
Yeah. And, if you read St. Augustine's writings against the Donatists, or even before him, the writings of St. Optatus, they're very clear. Like, you just can't have that kind of church. And that's not the way the early church looked at all. The short version of that is after the last of the major church persecutions, the Diocletian persecution, some of the bishops and priests had cooperated with the government in the persecution of Christians. It was horrible. And so people were understandably scandalized because, these people had caved under torture, they cooperated out of fear, and so they said, we're not going to go to their masses anymore. And the response was, well, they're still validly ordained. And so they don't lose that just because they've done something horrible. This becomes really important because it's the whole notion, a lot of sacramental theology is really clarified around this time, that if it takes the personal holiness of the priest for the sacraments to work, no priest is holy enough. It's not just a matter of whether he's in mortal sin or not. No priest is holy enough to turn bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus on his own authority. So either Jesus is working through his instruments, these sacred ministers, or we're all in a lot of trouble. And if he's working through his sacred ministers, it's okay if they're really broken instruments themselves. Now, hopefully they're not, right? For their own sake, for the sake of their congregation, hopefully they're all very holy. But the church basically, we already looked at this issue. We already came to a very clear conclusion on it. That conclusion is consistent with 2,000 years of church history. And so to reject that, you have to do what we have. You have to really drive the car all the way through 2,000 years, and it's going to get pretty dinged up along the way because you're going to have to run over all the church fathers and all the medieval scholars and everybody else who, until you get to the reformers, and you end up with something that makes kind of Swiss cheese of the New Testament. So it's not a very workable theory when you really drill down into it.
Yeah, very good. Now, so that was the reformers' position, and it seems like Protestantism is in many ways retreated even from, they actually had a higher view of the church than like your rank and file non-denom or Baptist church, where it's totally spiritual. It's just anyone who believes in Christ is part of the church.
Yeah, in the book, I steal Brian Cross's phrase for this, where he calls it ecclesial deism. And ecclesial deism just means this, like a lot of the founding fathers were deists, meaning they had this view that God kind of wound up all of reality and then just let us go. And so then God was kind of hands off, and he wasn't going to intervene. He doesn't really care what we do one way or the other. He just kind of created reality and let it go. And I think any Christian worth their salt is going to say, obviously, that's not true. Like, that is not the vision of God that we get from reality, nor is it the vision of God we get from Scripture. But the Protestant view of the church is kind of like Jesus winds up the church and then just lets it go and says, go join whatever church you want. And the remarkable thing about it is that really takes away any role of Jesus in his own church. Meaning this, like, if you want to take a great figure from history, like Plato or Aristotle or whatever, you're going to have followers of this great thinker who break off into different camps. They interpret him this way or that way. The philosopher Leo Strauss famously has East Coast Straussians and West Coast Straussians that are like this kind of like two denominations of followers of his. And so if you want to follow Leo Strauss, you figure out which of these has the better interpretation of Strauss and you go for it. Well, Jesus, if he did nothing, we would end up with Protestantism. We would end up with this situation where you've got this group over here trying to follow the teachings of Christ and that group over there. But in Matthew 16, Jesus says, upon this rock, I will build my church, which seems to say, no matter what you think upon this rock means, when he says, I will build my church, he seems to be saying pretty clearly, I'm not going to leave it up to this. I'm not going to leave it up to like groups of followers to band together however they see fit. Focus on the Family has some great stuff. Evangelical Protestant group, a lot of people may be familiar with. They've got some great stuff on the family, as you might expect from the name, in which they say, it is not up to us to create what the family looks like. Rather, we discover God's design for the family, that a mother and father and, that relationship to the child isn't something of human invention or human origin, but it's something we discover. And my point is just, wouldn't it be weird if that wasn't also true of the church? That we're supposed to just invent a church. We can't invent a family, but we can invent a church. It seems even stranger in some ways, given that the church is directly the province of God, that it would be left up to us to invent a religion for him or to invent a church for him.
Great point. Which word didn't you understand? I will build my church. If anything, like you said, you do walk away with the impression that Jesus established some church. And great points.
Yeah, it seems like you said, a lot of the modern kind of Protestant non-denominational view is, even in the term non-denominational, it's this idea, it's like almost a direct rejection of the idea that Jesus might have built this, that it isn't up to us to create our own thing. And I know they're trying to create something that isn't a denomination, but the result, of course, is that it ends up just being another man-made denomination that just calls itself not a denomination. Whereas like the true non-denominational Christians are Catholics. There's an example I give in the book where John Armstrong, an evangelical I really admire, it has a book called Your Church is Too Small, where he talks about in 1 Corinthians when St. Paul says, don't be a follower of Paul or of Cephas or, and says, well, likewise, we don't want to be a follower of Luther or Calvin or Pope Benedict, because that's who the Pope was at the time. And what struck me was the analogy broke down. And in the other ones, he had the founder of each one. When he got to Catholics, he couldn't give the founder of it because he'd have to say, don't be a follower of Jesus Christ. And that would be absurd because, of course, we should be followers of Christ. So this is, another area I'd like to press. Like, if the papacy isn't founded by Jesus, who is it founded by and when? And why don't we see a whole lot of people writing about how this usurping authority is trying to crush, the Christians of the day, or the free democratic Christianity that allegedly existed beforehand? We should see a whole lot of historical evidence for the rise of the papacy, and we just really don't. There's nothing of the sort that we see. It's all just an argument from silence, and the argument from silence doesn't stand up to any historical scrutiny.
Yeah, great point. Now, even though you will find people who might object certain aspects of the papacy, no one ever rejected that there was some sort of authority centered in Rome, that was connected to Peter's throne. It was always more nitpicking as to, well, how far that authority goes, or, things like that. But it was always assumed, right? So it's hard to point out where the great apostasy happened, supposedly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's such a strange argument to say, well, in the early church, you've got people who sound like Catholics and people who sound a little more like Orthodox, and therefore Protestantism is true. It's like, well, the one group you don't see represented are any people representing anything like Protestantism, other than by these groups that are so far out there that even Protestants would be afraid to call them forefathers, like the Gnostics, like the Donatists, who have these doctrines that are so wild that even a self-respecting Protestant would run away when they actually read what these guys thought and what they taught.
Yeah, absolutely. Although you do run into, I don't know if you've ever incurred it, Baptist successionist.
I actually address it in the book.
You do?
Landmark
Okay.
Baptists, yeah. I just give it a couple pages because it's such a weird theory. The theory is, so there's a famous book called The Trail of Blood that kind of popularized it in the 19th century. And it's this idea, the early church were actually Baptists. And there's all of these Baptists throughout history. And the best part is, get them to name names about the groups that were allegedly Baptist, like the Waldensians, like the Donatists, like sometimes they'll claim the Gnostics. And then when you really read the writings of the actual people who profess those beliefs, they're just shocking. And so there's actually great work done from some other Protestant scholars really picking this apart, saying, guys, the people you're claiming as forefathers, banned marriage and had an insane view of the body, or they had really promiscuous views of sexuality, or just things that would make any Baptist aghast in horror if they actually knew the people they were claiming to be descended from. It's actually less shameful that you came from the Anabaptists, which any historian will tell you is the truth, than that you came from these insane Gnostics from the 6th century or whatever. These groups that they're claiming, it would just be totally mad if they had any idea of church history. They wouldn't try to claim succession from them, because they didn't believe in what Baptists believe in, and they believed in a whole lot of other stuff that Baptists do not believe in at all.
Yeah, exactly. Like baptismal regeneration and real presence in the Eucharist and stuff like that. I think that would probably horrify them even more than, that there's more than one God or something like that. Yeah, great. We could probably do an entire show on the Trail of Blood. That maybe it's worth doing. Who knows?
I would love to. Actually, you know what? If viewers aren't going to be or listeners aren't going to be totally annoyed hearing a weird view, as long as people know, we know most Baptists don't think this. There are some Baptists who don't have a good view of church history who've heard this, and it's so weird and so bizarre that most people don't bother actually responding to it. I'd love to kind of pick apart the particulars of it, because it is a very strange and very historically absurd kind of position.
Yeah, it's kind of like the ultimate Protestant conspiracy theory in a way. Hidden group of continuous group of Protestants being persecuted by the church, and then of course all their documents that prove they're Protestant are destroyed by the church, and so on and so forth. Yeah, we should do that. Maybe we'll do that for a future show.
I like it. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, let's see. We only have a couple of minutes. Why don't you tell us how people can get to your blog and also where to get the book?
Okay, great. So I blog at shamelesspopery.com. I work for School of Faith, schooloffaith.com. You can get my book at shop.catholic.com or amazon.com. And again, the name is Pope Peter, Defending the Church's Most Distinctive Doctrine in a Time of Crisis.
Excellent. Well, hey, thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, great stuff. Yeah, check it out, folks. Get the book, Pope Peter from Catholic Answers Press. Lots of great stuff. Man, I can't believe the hour's flown. We had so much fun. Thank you so much for listening, and never fear, because Terry and Jesse will soon be here. The Batman and Robin of High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. Thank you so much for listening, and God willing, we'll be back again tomorrow to do this thing called Apologetics. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great day.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.